right, let's get into it. Every once in a while, we get a story that transcends sports and becomes a bigger story. The kind of story that even people who do not follow college sports or even sports at all become interested in. And we now have that story in college basketball. It, of course, is the Brandon Miller story. Just one day after police detail the role that Brandon Miller played in actions leading up to last month's shooting death of Jamia Harris, a 23-year-old mother, Brandon Miller was allowed to play for Alabama at South Carolina on Wednesday night. It created a weird, awkward scene. Miller was booed. He was met with chants of lock him up. He was taunted. He took 25 shots, made 14 of them, finished with a career high 41 points and a 78-76 overtime victory at South Carolina. He made the shot that forced overtime. He made the shot that won the game. He is currently arguably the most talked about athlete in this country, with the debate still raging on about whether this young man should be representing a prominent university, given that he quite literally brought a gun to a place where it was very quickly used after he arrived to shoot 23-year-old mother in the face and kill her. Now a 5-year-old little boy no longer has his mother. Jamia Harris's family expressed disappointment on Thursday that Brandon Miller was allowed to play on Wednesday night. They said Nate Oates' comments earlier in the week were, quote, disrespectful. And proof that this story is now bigger than college basketball and really bigger than sports is that, over the past couple of days, I've made appearances on Inside Edition. I talked with Harvey Levin on TMZ Live, and even Harvey, as he was introducing the piece, said this is not the type of thing we would normally talk about, but we're talking about it now. Norlander, it appears that Alabama has gone from one of the best stories in college basketball to the clear-cut most controversial one. What do you make of where we're at with that situation right now?
Well, as we record here Friday morning, Nate Oates will speak again to the media about 90 minutes from now. Our podcast will be done by then. So I just want to lay it out up top here for anyone getting to this pod at any point on Friday afternoon, evening, or even over the weekend. There's the possibility Oates could actually say something to advance the story. We don't know what that is, and you could be listening to the overwhelming majority of our listeners who get this via traditional means over the phone. I at least want to address that part. I don't know if he will or he won't, but there is a chance he could say something in that press conference that advances the story, but potentially not. I talked to Wednesday was surreal. It was awkward. I talked to an NBA scout that was in the building. Also said, like, the energy in the building was also bizarre because, like, there were a couple of fights that apparently broke out in skirmishes between, like, Alabama fans that were there and then the South Carolina fans that were chanting guilty at him and heckling Brandon Miller. It was described to me as at points an uncomfortable scene overall. But Alabama did bring it upon itself with all of this. And it seems determined to continue to play Miller and Bradley. I would just like a little bit more of an explanation. Some people have kind of pushed back on that and saying, like, what other explanation does Alabama need to give? Why does it need to appease anyone else? It's done its diligence. I actually has it, because the one thing that did stick out to me, Greg Byrne went on the College Game Day podcast and seemed to indicate that there were actually details that came out in the pretrial testimony from the law enforcement officer about the text message being sent and just the nature of Brandon Miller and what he did, that if you take Byrne's word at it, they were not aware of that. And what does that signal to me? It actually signals to me that the school didn't, and it never announced it. So we are left of the understanding that the school actually never conducted an actual investigation of the matter, which seems extremely negligent. I have no doubt that Nate Oates and Byrne, I have no doubt that there were people that, Brandon Miller and Jaden Bradley were sat down and talked to and potentially informally questioned, but it does not appear as though there was an actual formal investigation of this thing. So that only piles on to the problematic nature of all of this. And the story that you referenced from AL.com, obviously, extremely powerful story that detail, it's Jamia Harris' stepfather, who is now, along with the rest of her family, going to raise their 5-year-old son, Kane, or their grandson, in effect. But in talking about this elsewhere, it seems like this story is destined to just be there continuously. We're not going to get to March 4th, and just because we're gearing up for conference tournaments and there's bubble teams to talk about, we'll talk about all that stuff. Alabama is only going to draw more attention the further it goes. It is one of the best teams in the country. Brandon Miller is one of the best players in the country. He's a first-team All-American. He dropped 41, and the timing of it was I just can't remember ever seeing something like that in college sports. He's in the midst of a maelstrom and goes out and is almost single-handedly responsible for ensuring that Alabama doesn't take on by far its worst loss of the season. And it comes amid the backdrop of like actual human tragedy. So it's been a tough season for college basketball headline wise. I mentioned this on the previous podcast, but I do just want to reiterate, we talk about these things because we need to talk about them, but it's not fun to talk about this. You had the Chris Beard stuff, New Mexico State stuff. Now you have the Alabama stuff. Even the Michigan State story, which was not the same. It was a program and a campus community affected by needless gun violence. So Alabama will continue to be at the front of mind and be talked about on broadcasts, in podcasts, in columns, on radio shows, on TV shows. I think it's led PTI 2 consecutive days in a row. The first top of the A segment there, and as it should. So we go 3 weeks down the road and nothing has happened, and it's kind of been, business as usual with the program. Then yeah, when we talk about Alabama being the number 1 seed in the Midwest or wherever it's going to be, it's the Brandon Miller story will be right alongside it the whole time. Press conferences, every NCAA tournament. Nate Oates can eventually hit a point where he doesn't want to talk about it. They can hide Brandon Miller all they want, and they probably will. That will certainly be interesting to see when Brandon Miller actually speaks to the media again. But this is a story that is not simply going to dissipate because we have a news cycle that will renew and refresh and refresh and refresh. It will not be as prominent probably over the next 5 to 10 days, but it will linger. It will be there throughout the remainder of the season, and so long as Brandon Miller is enrolled in that university.
Yeah, it's not going away. The further Alabama goes into the season, the bigger the story will get. It'll be a big story in the round of 64, a bigger story in the round of 32, a bigger story in the Sweet 16, bigger story in the Elite 8. And if they get to the Final Four, it will be a massive story. It will be the biggest story at the Final Four. And I don't even care who else is at the Final Four. It's interesting because there was a time maybe literally just a week ago where you could reasonably say, man, wouldn't it be great if you're an Alabama fan if we go to the Final Four for the first time in school history? And on a very basic level, of course, that would be great even still. But now going to the Final Four is going to put you on a stage where people aren't talking about how awesome your basketball team is. That's not going to be why CNN or any other, Fox News sends reporters to the Final Four. It ain't going to be to do stories about how awesome your basketball team is, how wild it is that this so-called football school now has a basketball team just 2 wins away from a national championship. The story is going to be about this school allowing Brandon Miller to continue to play under these circumstances. And so this is not going to be comfortable for Nate Oates or anybody else the rest of this season. The decisions they have made and how they've handled this situation have made it where it's going to be awkward for them until they play their last game. The point you make about Greg Byrne and what he said this week is important because he did detail that he and Nate Oates and the school in general did learn new things Tuesday in court about this situation. Specifically, they learned for the first time that Brandon Miller is the one that drove the gun to the scene of the incident after receiving a text message from his now former teammate Darius Miles. And what that means is that Alabama was allowing Brandon Miller to continue playing without having a full understanding of exactly the role Brandon Miller played in this tragedy. most times when a school is having to deal with possible legal issues with a student athlete, they will say something along the lines of, we are withholding this player from competition while we are in a fact gathering phase until we gather all the facts. This happens when often a player is accused of, say, sexual assault. They'll withhold the player from competition while they're in the fact gathering phase. Well, for Alabama, there really doesn't appear that there was a fact gathering phase at all, because they, by their own admission, by the admission of Greg Byrne, they were playing Brandon Miller without even understanding or realizing that his teammate texted him and said, "Bring me the gun." And then Brandon Miller showed up with the gun that very quickly was used to kill Jamea Harris. Here's a statement Greg Byrne released on Wednesday. He said, "Our role in a criminal investigation is to support law enforcement, not to conduct our own investigation and not to interfere with their efforts. Although we're not investigators, we do have a duty to evaluate whether anyone involved in our program has violated the rules, policies, or standards of the university. We have that evaluation based on facts," end quote. Here's a quick question for you, Norlander. So is riding around Tuscaloosa well after midnight with a loaded gun that doesn't belong to you, is that not a violation of rules, policies, or standards of the Alabama basketball program or the University of Alabama in general? Like, what if Nate Oates had gathered his whole team yesterday and said, "Hey, guys, nice win at South Carolina. What do you guys got going on tonight?" And what if every single player said, "Coach, I'm going to get a loaded gun and I'm going to drive around with it in my car all night long tonight, well after midnight, probably be out till around 2 or so." Would that just be okay? Because according to what Greg Byrne said, Brandon Miller has not violated rules, policies, or standards. But what Brandon Miller did is drive around well after midnight with a loaded gun that doesn't belong to him in his car. I don't understand how that couldn't violate some policy, some rule, or some standard. As I've said multiple times in multiple places this week, if you don't have a rule connected to your program that was violated by what Brandon Miller did on that late Saturday, early Sunday, then I don't know what type of program you're actually running. The other thing, real quick, that I want to clarify is something about Brandon Miller's supposed knowledge of the gun being in his car, because I've had a lot of people. I mean, in the like, my mentions are just nonstop. People arguing back and forth. And I've had a lot of people make the statement that, well, do you realize, GP or anybody else who thinks Brandon Miller should be suspended, that Brandon Miller's attorney said that Brandon Miller didn't even know the gun was in the car. Brandon Miller didn't know the gun was in the car.
That's not accurate.
Brandon Miller's attorney said he didn't know the gun was in the car. That is not what Brandon Miller's attorney said. And I can't
if Brandon Miller's attorney could say it, he would say it. Let's be clear about that.
It'd be the first thing you'd say.
It would be the first
thing he would say.
Correct.
And he has not said that. He said a lot of things that has tricked some people into thinking that's what he said. But he did not actually say that. Here's what he said. He said Brandon Miller didn't handle the gun. He said Brandon Miller didn't touch the gun. He said Brandon Miller didn't even see the gun. But he did not say Brandon Miller didn't know the gun was in the car. Go read the statement again. And this is not a point I've heard anybody else make. The attorney did not say Brandon Miller did not know the gun was in the car. He said he didn't touch it, didn't handle it, didn't see it. But he stopped well short of saying he didn't even know the gun was in the car. Because if you can actually say, listen, guys, you could twist this in whatever you want to. Let me tell you what happened. Brandon Miller took a teammate and a teammate's friend to a club, and then he left them there. And then he came back to pick them up later. And yeah, it turns out there was a gun in the car, but he had no idea he had no idea he was driving around with a gun in a car. He had no idea he was bringing a gun to this scene. This is just a gun literally somebody left in the back seat, covered up, and he had no idea. What did he do wrong? What if somebody you were riding around with left something in your car? Is that like your fault? Does that mean you're you should be punished in any sort of meaningful way. If you genuinely did not know, it's a great story to tell if that's actually the case. That's not what happened here. And that's why the attorney is not saying Brandon Miller didn't know the gun was in the car. He's saying he didn't touch it, didn't handle it, didn't see it. Okay, fine. But he doesn't say he didn't know it was in the car. And the reason is because it is, at this point, very difficult to believe that Brandon Miller didn't know that the gun was in the car. A, because the lawyer won't say that, hasn't said that to date. And B, because I can't stress this enough, go back to the text message Darius Miles sent to Brandon Miller. You know what that text message says? I need my joint. Bring me my gun. That's what the text message meant. Now, think about this. The text is only that simple. I need my joint. If the person you're texting knows exactly where your joint is. Like, Norlander, if I leave my glasses somewhere and I need you to grab them for me and you don't know where they are, the text message will be, hey, Deadleg, can you bring me my glasses? I left them at your desk. Hey, can you bring me my phone? I left it on your table. Darius Miles didn't have to tell Brandon Miller where the gun was, presumably because he knew Brandon Miller knew where the gun was. And that's an important distinction to make because most people have totally missed that. Both dumb fans and even some media members who I've heard parrot that comment. Well, the lawyer said he didn't know the gun was in the car. No. That's not what the lawyer said. He never said that. Again, if Darius Miles didn't know Brandon Miller knew exactly where that gun was, the text message has to be, hey, I need my gun. I left it in your car. It's in your back seat. Can you bring it here for me? He didn't say any of that. It was just, hey, I need my gun. He didn't feel like he had to say anything else because he didn't feel like he had to tell Brandon Miller where the gun is. Why? Because he, again, presumably knew that Brandon Miller knew where that gun was. And again, if Brandon Miller genuinely didn't know the gun was in the car, that he was driving to this scene with a gun in his car, that is the first thing his criminal attorney would have said, and he hasn't said it yet.
Okay, there's one other part to this. I'm going to read part of the statement from the attorney, which came out after our previous podcast, which is why we're also addressing this. And we will get to the weekend, and we got stuff to talk about, but one more thing on this. So the statement from the attorney reads, before Brandon arrived to pick up Mr. Miles and the individual with Miss Harris apparently exchanged words. Without Brandon knowing any of this context, and as Brandon was already on the way to pick up Mr. Miles texted Brandon and asked him to bring him his firearm. Brandon subsequently arrived at the scene to pick up Mr. Miles. Okay, go back, hit the rewind button 15 seconds and listen to me read that again. Brandon never got out of his vehicle or interacted with anyone in Miss Harris's party. He was never involved in a verbal altercation with Cedric Johnson or Mr. Davis. Okay, so just two things from this here, because again, this is Jim Standridge. Sure, he's a well-accomplished and extremely competent attorney. This whole statement, frankly, looks like he's doing a great job of being a defense attorney, what he's paid to do, to paint the situation in the best possible light, ideally, factually, accurately for his client. There is no indication that Brandon Miller was not aware of the contents of that text message that was sent. That would also be in this statement. If Brandon Miller never read the text message prior to arriving, the defense attorney would put that in the statement.
That's exactly right.
In the statement.
That's exactly right. Because Brandon Miller has reportedly turned over his phone to police.
Correct.
They can tell when you looked at that text message.
There's metadata that would reveal this. Correct.
And absolutely. If the lawyer knew that when the law enforcement officials, investigators looked at that phone and it was going to show, Brandon Miller never even saw the text message until after he arrived at the scene. That would have been in the statement. That's not in the statement. Again, it's a trick. They try to say he was already on his way, and then Darius Miles text message, and then Brandon Miller, to make you think, oh, well, Brandon Miller wasn't going there to deliver the gun as much as he was just going there to pick up his friend, and then all this stuff was sort of happening. He had no idea. If that were the case, they would have said it. They haven't said that. It's a trick. It's what lawyers do. They frame things in ways that are technically accurate, but sometimes misleading. Now, if you just read it carefully, you shouldn't be misled. But I couldn't help but notice there are if not hundreds, maybe thousands. I don't know what the number is, but a lot of people who have totally misinterpreted that lawyer's statement. They think he said something he did not say, and it is 100% true as of this moment. The lawyer has never said Brandon Miller didn't know that the gun was in the car, and the lawyer has never said that Brandon Miller had no idea his friend had requested that gun.
To recap, with everything that we've talked about here in the first 20 minutes of the show, it looks just so terrible for Alabama. There's been no indication that they actually conducted an internal investigation at the university level, which would seem to be the bare minimum to do this. And
or let me say, because Greg Byrne did say we are not doing, it's not our job to do an investigation. It's our job to not get in the way of law enforcement's investigation.
Fine.
Okay,
come on.
Here's what I would say. Fine, but you know what you do while law enforcement is still investigating? You withhold the player from competition.
Correct. All right. One action or the other here, and neither appears to have happened. At the center of all this is that it could have been so much worse. There were 11 shots fired. This lawyer statement says, and I didn't pick up on this when it broke Tuesday until the lawyer statement. Brandon never got out of his vehicle or interacted with anyone in Miss Harris's party. Are you telling me right now that Brandon Miller stayed in his car? 2 gunshots into his windshield. He almost could have been killed. Did he narrowly avoid dying as well? This situation could have been, for as tragic as it already is, and again, I'm going to use the word again, infuriating. If you read through what happened, it just pisses me off. And it could have been so much worse. Brandon Miller is lucky if the way that this lawyer statement is reflective of what happened, that Brandon Miller stayed in his car, because this is it's a quick period of time between the text message getting sent and Jamia Harris being killed. It's not a lot. It's a matter of minutes. So if what happened there is Miller and Bradley, who also had his car there, they pull up, and within minutes of that happening, Miller is just in his car, and then his vehicle is taken on gunfire, and he's sitting in the driver's seat. And it's scary as hell, dude. Like the whole thing is scary, but I haven't seen too many people pick up on that, because I guess there's the chance that he did leave the vehicle, but the lawyer statement says he never got out of his vehicle, and he took on 2 bullets in the windshield. So, yeah, it's we'll see what Nate Oates says here in about an hour when he talks, but there's one more. There's one more sentence in the statement. As soon as he was notified that someone had been injured and the police wished to speak with him, he has fully cooperated with law enforcement's investigation. I'm not going to push back that he has fully cooperated, but there are just, again, lawyers speak. There's just, Brandon quickly left the area when gunfire erupted. So he was in his car, gunfire erupted. Was he trying to get out of his car when the shots happened? I don't know. It seemed like this was something that was understandably a panic situation by other witnesses involved, and then he cooperated fully. Jaden Bradley have cooperated fully. Again, my central point just goes back to how the university handled this, and the fact that this was never previously disclosed, and now this is what Alabama is dealing with here. And unless something changes today or in the next 24 48 hours, it's going to accept this, and in doing so, every time until there is much more that is explained, it's just going to have to deal with, being the really, the villain in this greater narrative arc of the season. Like Alabama, outside of Crimson Tide fans, there's not going to be a lot of people that are like rooting to watch Alabama play to win. Period. They're actually doing a lot of serious damage to their overall university image by continuing to handle things as they've handled it. One last time for me, if we get something else from Nate Oates in an hour, we will, and perhaps the story will move in a different direction, but we don't have that right now.
And the other thing you find out in times like these in our profession is like, who's equipped to talk about this honestly and who's just ill-equipped to talk about this honestly. It is interesting to watch people have real strong opinions about, who should be the national coach of the year and who should be the Big Ten coach of the year or the Big Ten player of the year. But when it comes to something serious, they can't quite bring themselves to talk about it intelligently or with any sort of intelligence or passion. I've seen so many people who talk about this sport every day just completely shut up. Won't say a word about it. Don't know how to talk about it. So, like, why am I getting asked to go on TMZ Live and Inside of this? Because I'm comfortable talking about this stuff. Listen, we all like Nate Oates and respect him as a basketball coach, but there comes a time where if it's your job to talk and write about this stuff, that you got to be able to put that aside and say, yo, I like Nate Oates. I think he's an unbelievable basketball coach, but they are not handling this the right way. They have messed this up. They are playing somebody they should not be playing. And if he were a walk-on, he would not be playing. If he were a walk-on, I don't even think he'd be a part of this team anymore. That's the truth with Brandon Miller. And, yeah, these are the moments where you separate the people who can talk about this stuff from the people who would rather just avoid it completely.